Okay. Hey, everybody. Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Hope you're all doing well. As I hope you can see from the screen, you are here for a webinar called What Communication Staff Need to Know About Evaluation, Part 1. Part 1, because we're actually going to do a Part 2. Elena Harman, who is amazing. She's the CEO of Vantage Evaluations. She's an MIT-trained researcher and professional evaluator. We've seen such an amazing response to this webinar that we're actually going to break it into 2 pieces. So we're going to do one today, and we'll come back at you in about 3 or 4 weeks' time with the second part. But today, we are going to focus on what we promised you, which is how to think about evaluations through the context of your communications work. How can you keep track of what's working, and frankly, in some cases, what's not, right? And that is so incredibly critical. As a matter of fact, today is going to, among many things, Elena's going to teach you how to use proper evaluation in service of your communications work. You know, one hint that we talked about in the note that we sent out to you all, inviting you here, you might want to ditch that post-conference survey. As a matter of fact, we're probably going to do that ourselves at ComNet, so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I needed to give you a couple quick logistical items before we get underway. We are using a service called Zoom, which is awesome. But if you've not used it before, you have the ability to type questions in the little box down at the bottom. It says Q&A just down there if you're looking. If you're not seeing your box, if you minimize your screen, a bunch of things will pop up. You can mute yourself. You can see who the participants are, I believe. Got like 200 and some people in here with us right now. That Q&A box to ask questions. You can also vote for questions. You can vote up questions. Elena and I are sure to get to them. You can also chit-chat with one another. I just send them to say, tell me who you are and where you're from and all that good stuff. So please do so. You can also, as we do, we'll take questions across the presentation. You can also engage with on Twitter. Our good friend Yabby is just downstairs from where we are right now at Network HQ, and she is manning the hashtag ComNetLive. That's COMNETLIVE. You can put in questions for us there. Also share comments or takeaways from this presentation. And as we always do, someone always asks, so let me tell you the answer. We are recording this. We will make it available on our YouTube channel in just a matter of days, where it's going to be available for free replay. So if you want to share this with a colleague who couldn't be with us while we're here, happy to do so. Welcome to do so. So I guess with that, thanks for joining us. And Elena, you want to take it away?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here with us today. Before we jump in, just a little bit more about me, and thank you, Sean, for the wonderful introduction. So I've been an evaluator for about 10 years now, and my orientation around evaluation is that I've always been really deeply passionate about the potential of evaluation to contribute to the nonprofit sector, and really disappointed by the way it turns out in practice in reality. And so my goal over the next few years is to really try and engage a more diverse array of nonprofit stakeholders in evaluation conversations. And so today's webinar and the content in April is really oriented around that effort to try and figure out how evaluation can serve nonprofits better through the individuals that work for each nonprofit. So before we get into it, a little bit of orientation around what we're going to talk about today. There are 2 halves of this conversation. So the piece that we're going to focus on today is how evaluation can serve you in your communications roles and to help you be a more effective professional. Next time, what we're going to focus on is how communications professionals can help the evaluation work at their organizations be more effective. So that's why the part 1 and part 2 came up. So for today, we're going to start with a little bit of reframing of evaluation. Then we're going to move into the content around evaluation, how evaluation can be in service of communication. And we'll have a good amount of time for question and answers at the end. But as Sean mentioned, it's also spread throughout. So please do feel free to ask questions as they come up, and we'll have pause points along the way to address them. So the first place we want to start is really in regrouping what we mean by evaluation. Unfortunately, everyone comes to this conversation with a different set of evaluation baggage. So I want to take a little bit of time to make sure that we're setting the stage carefully and correctly for this conversation. So my intention with this first section is to share 4 mindsets about evaluation that I hold near and dear to my heart and influence how I think about this work every single day that I hope that you'll try and emphasize today. So just as I'm talking through this section, think about how these different mindsets might affect how you've traditionally thought about and used evaluation, and just give it a try today. See if your approach to evaluation and your experience of evaluation differs with these different ways of thinking about the work. So the first thing that I want to encourage you to think about is the fact that evaluation is about people. It is not about numbers. It can be really, really easy to think about evaluation and metrics as synonymous, as the exact same thing, but they're not. Evaluation is much bigger than just metrics. It's bigger than numbers, it's bigger than data. What evaluation really is a process through which we understand what works and what doesn't. And when we think too narrowly about evaluation, that's when we get trapped behind those vanity metrics that don't actually help us learn and do our jobs better. So throughout our time today, I want to encourage you to think broader about evaluation than maybe you traditionally have. So don't limit yourself to the things that you've always reported, but consider what in the material I share today might help you tell a more complete story about the impact of your communications work. The second mindset I want to suggest is that if evaluation is a process, as I just mentioned, what does that process look like? And this brings up a really important point about the purpose of evaluation. Originally, back in the 1960s, evaluation emerged during the expansion of Great Society programs as a way to make sure that social service programs did not waste government money. So it's no wonder that evaluation can often feel like a gotcha exercise, right? We feel like evaluation is trying to catch nonprofits who are doing less than stellar work and is really mainly for reporting to funders to show them that, yes, we're good stewards of your resources. So today I want you to think through what it would look like if we flipped this on its head. And if we thought of evaluation as a learning process instead of an accountability tool. So in an ideal world, you would develop programming, whether that's the programming that your organization runs as its core mission, or the programming that you as a communications shop are focused on. That programming would dictate the evaluation necessary to help you learn what works and what doesn't. And then those insights that you generated from evaluation would lead into learning about your programs and about your work, which in turn would inform the planning and programming that you're doing every day. So I want to suggest that evaluation is the most powerful when it is embedded in this strategic process, when it is not just a one-off, hey, we're going to do this evaluation so that we can report to people outside the organization. And when it's really oriented towards learning instead of reporting purposes. Now, I do want to say that doesn't mean that you can't use evaluation for reporting. That's always going to be a part of it. I'm just hoping that that will become the secondary goal of this work instead of the primary goal. So I alluded to this a little bit, but in order for evaluation to be about more than learning, we have to, learning more than accountability, we have to rethink where that evaluation ask comes from. So traditionally, you might be familiar with an approach that looks something like this, where the evaluation needs come first and foremost from your funder, second from your board, and the things that you want to evaluate as a nonprofit come last. We have to swap this order, and we have to make sure, we have to make sure, there's a word missing here, but we have to make sure that the nonprofit evaluation needs are coming first and foremost, and then your board, and lastly to external stakeholders like your funders. So what do you really want to know about your work instead of what do others outside the organization want to know about what you're doing? And the last mindset shift I'd encourage you to try on today is this idea that evaluation is really a team sport. It has not worked to force evaluation into one person's job description. So whether that's an internal evaluator or an external contractor or a program manager who has evaluation written into part of their job, evaluation is like strategy. Even if you have someone who's facilitating and guiding that process, it only really works when every staff member is engaged. So this is my little, cheat sheet around evaluation. So the spine, those numbers down the center are the basic processes related to evaluation. And the 5 limbs, head, arms, and feet of this little gingerbread man are some of the key roles that are engaged in this. And so you'll see communication staff is a role that I talk about as being the hands of evaluation. So they are really the doers. They're often the ones who are being asked to implement evaluation in their own work and to communicate about evaluation externally. So back to those 2 parts again. So with these 4 mindset shifts that I want to encourage you to think about today, evaluation really works best when all 4 of these are at play. So first is really taking a broad definition of what counts as data and what evaluation sources you have available to you. The second is a true orientation towards learning and an emphasis not on what you need to report to funders, but on what your nonprofit wants to know about its work and its effectiveness. And then the last piece is this idea of evaluation as a team sport. So as we proceed through the bulk of the content today, I just want you to think about how these 4 principles, or maybe just the one that resonates strongest with you, could change the way that you utilize evaluation in your communications work. So with that, I'm going to jump right into the meat of it so that you can see how these principles play out in the changes that I'm suggesting you make to the way you think about evaluation. So today we're going to focus on 4 key areas, core areas of the communication staff workload, and talk about some simple shifts that you can make to evaluating these areas to make them work better for you. So we're going to talk about conferences and events, reports and publication, public relations and media outreach work, and lastly, social media metrics. So let's start one by one and go through these, and we'll have a Q&A break at a couple of different points throughout this part of the section. So let's start with events and conferences. So you guys know the story. An organization hosts an event or conference, and they want feedback on how that event went. So they send out a post-event survey, and nothing useful comes back. They hear the same things that they've already heard, or they get a couple of surveys from squeaky wheels and from no one else. The response rate is maybe under 10% on a good day. And so they do the same event next year, just assuming that if they didn't hear about it, nothing needs to change. Or they make changes based on their gut experience. And I understand why people do that, but there's a little bit of a disconnect between, hey, we really want feedback on our event, and we're not getting it through our post-conference survey, so let's just keep doing our post-conference survey. So my question is, how do we fix
Guilty.
it? I think we all are. I think everyone has we've all probably sent out the post-conference survey, and we have all certainly seen it. We've all certainly gotten it through our inbox. And so the first question I want to posit is, why do we even send out post-conference surveys to begin with? The answer to that, I think, is because we do authentically want feedback. It's something that feels like a good idea. We want to understand the value of our work. We want to make sure that we are providing something of service to our community. So if our intentions are so good, why are our post-conference surveys not yielding useful information? Well, there's a couple of different reasons. First is because people have terrible memories. So the moment that they leave your event, their recollection of what worked for them and what didn't immediately starts to go down. And so by the time they travel home, they get to a place where they can fill out their survey, they get through all their other really pressing business, and they actually sit down to give you feedback. Those really tangible, useful insights have left their brain already. So you're not asking them questions at a time that facilitates really rich feedback. The second reason why post-conference surveys tend not to be so useful is because if it was a major issue, you probably already know about it. And I get this feedback a lot. Well, okay, well, one person told me this was an issue. So yeah, I know about it, but I want to know how many people experience that. And my question is, why? Do you trust it less because one person gave it to you than if 40 people came up to you and told you the rooms were too cold? The third piece of this is very closely related, which is that we are all terrible survey writers, especially when we organize the event. Even if we're trying to write a good survey, we all have a tendency to write surveys that get positive feedback because we're so invested in the event and we come at it from the assumption that the event worked. And so that framing automatically goes into the questions that we ask. And the fourth piece of this is because humans are all sick of filling out surveys. I don't know about you guys, but I get maybe 5 surveys a week, and I fill them out because I'm a nerd and I love seeing other people's survey questions, but most people don't. There is such a proliferation of these Survey Monkey, let's survey about everything instruments that the survey fatigue that people are experiencing is alone a reason to pause on the post-conference surveys. So now that I've convinced you, hopefully, that post-conference surveys are not an effective way to get feedback, what are the alternatives? The very first thing you should do is, even if you replace it with nothing, you should absolutely stop sending out your post-conference survey because it is not getting good information and it is affecting the experience of your participants in your program.
Will you write a note to all of the people here, to their bosses, so they can stop doing this?
I would happily write a note. I always make these offers to help support, but it really is that piece around, you know, you're not getting good feedback anyway. And so it's time that you're spending on the post-conference survey. It's also time that you're asking for from your participants that is not benefiting anyone. And so when you're trying to be respectful and build relationships with these participants, that's not a great way to do it.
Can I play the healthy skeptic here? Isn't there
Please.
a little piece of this that's useful? So maybe if it's not 100% effective, maybe it's like 15% of it's kind of sort of useful. Like, turns out a lot of people in San Francisco didn't like the food that we served last year. Good to know, I suppose,
Yeah.
right?
Let me suggest some alternative ways where you can get that feedback. So if 15% of it is useful, that's a good reason to still collect feedback. It's not a good reason to still do it through a survey. So if someone came to me and said, hey, we're going to evaluate our conference, I would never say, hey, a survey is the right way to do that. As a researcher, as an evaluator, it's just not best practice in terms of when you should be collecting feedback from participants. So let's talk through the most common things that event organizers want to know and an alternative mechanism to get that feedback, and we will get to the bad chicken in just a second. So the first question that I hear a lot is that people want to understand how attendees are engaging in the content. And the best way to answer this question is absolutely not by asking somebody after the fact on a survey, hey, which sessions did you go to and which did you like the best? Because remember, people don't remember. You probably don't remember me saying that people don't remember.
I'm telling you, we ask that question, and the number of question marks we get next to that survey, or I think the one with the thing about comms, which at a comms conference sometimes not super instructive.
Absolutely. And the other piece of it is that in terms of surveys, we should never be asking people things that we can observe. And so my suggestion for this is, instead of asking this on a survey, think about how you can observe the way that attendees are engaging in a really structured, intentional way. So for example, can you create a guide of the types of information, the types of behaviors that you would see if people were engaging? So at the simplest level, how many people are attending each session? That's a really good suggestion to how useful people find the content. Even better, how many people show up, and then how many people leave midway through the session? These are behaviors that you can observe in a conference setting. If you have room hosts, that's a great way to just capture it right there, add it to their job. At a deeper level, you can think about, are people asking questions? Are you seeing people take notes? Are you seeing people vigorously nod during your keynote, or are they all on their phones? Are people participating in the interactive components of exercises? Are people talking to the speakers afterwards, going up, getting more information, going up, getting answers? And even beyond the sessions, that's sort of some examples in the content focus piece, but we all know a big part of events is the connections and networking. So outside of the sessions, what kind of interactions are you seeing in the hallways? Are people talking to each other? Are they making new connections or reconnecting with old ones? How many people are sort of feeling left out and isolated and hanging out by themselves outside a conference? So my suggestion on this is, instead of using those post-conference surveys, can you train some volunteers or some other folks on your staff? Because remember, evaluation is a team sport, and we should be asking for engagement from the rest of our team to observe some of these behaviors. The next question I see a lot is, what are individuals learning? We all want to know, like, is the content from our event resonating with people? And so again, this is something that you can just ask them at the event. One of my favorite ways to do this is to take over a wall with some sort of attractive, engaging display, have somebody stand at the wall to make sure that people are noticing that they can put things up, and do a little bit of peer pressure to get some feedback there. And give people sticky notes to put up the things that they're learning. This not only captures feedback, but can help spark discussion between attendees. So I've seen it in the past where people will come up and read other people's sticky notes, and when they see a sticky note and they're like, oh man, I really would have loved to learn that, then they keep an eye out for people who attended that session and from whom they might be able to learn secondhand the information that was really engaging to their peers. The default question that I use for this is, what is the most exciting thing that you learned today? So a single question always works best. And what I mean by a single question is not, what have you learned today? But what is the most exciting thing, the single most exciting thing you learned? That's always a stronger way to structure these questions. So a little tip on this. The picture on the left hand was from a particular event that we did this at, and we were able to tailor the question a little bit more, but this question around the most exciting thing you learned is a great default if you're just starting out with this practice. Next thing we hear a lot from event organizers is that they want to understand what actions participants will take as they're leaving events. Because these events and conferences are rarely just an opportunity to learn. Planners want people to do something differently. And so one of my favorite approaches for these real-time feedback things is something called a commitment card, where you're asking people very specifically what they will do as a result of this event. And so this example right here is actually from the Holocaust Museum in DC. So here everyone's taking pictures of the museum. I'm taking pictures of the feedback opportunities because they're just so cool in this particular museum. And this was one of my favorites, is that as you're leaving the museum, everyone's given a different colored card. And you'll see some of these have that commitment card vibe. So when I leave the museum, I will think differently about what message will stay with you as you're leaving this museum. And then you could either put them in sort of a confidential little box, or you could hang them on this pegboard and have everyone see. And I assume they collect them periodically. And I bet that they use them for these feedback purposes. So again, with that single focused question, if you don't know what to ask, I would recommend using this question as a result of your participation in ComNet, in Elena's Tuesday webinar. What is one thing you will change to make your work more effective? And I left off the end of that question.
So, hey, Elena, can I jump in with a quick question here?
Of course.
So you're a scientist, and I'm not, but this doesn't feel super scientific.
Do surveys?
I guess I have to unlearn that, but my instinct is yeah, because then I can make percentage quotes, right? I can say to my board, 80% of the people hated the chicken, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to I observed no one ate the chicken. Help me understand how to square those two things.
So we'll get to the chicken again, because that's a different scenario, but it is that unlearning of what we've learned, that numbers are sort of the best way to report out to our board. And it's related to that idea of like, this is useful to the extent that it helps you do your job better. I don't totally care. Like, I can help you find that 80% number to report to your funder. This is not the best way to do it. And so the goal here is to ask people consistent questions and get these percentage answers. The goal here is to get really substantive, rich feedback that can help you change the way you do your work. So it's a different way of thinking about what counts as valid evidence. I want to give you one more example of these commitment cards because I really, really like this one. This was at just a one-time dinner, but they put these commitment questions in the back of our name tags. So instead of taking up a wall somewhere, it was just like subtly tucked into the name tags, which I really liked and thought was a really applicable way of doing this work. And then we get to the chicken. So we always get these questions around what about the food, what about the speakers, what about the setting? And my answer to this is that you usually know, right? If the chicken's dry, you know, and also you're probably not going to change it because chicken is cheaper and you have limited menu choices. And if the rooms are cold, you already know. But if you must ask, and I understand the impulse too, because you always want to give people an opportunity to give you that feedback without having to seek you out, consider a simple suggestion wheel. So this is one that we made ourselves for one of our workshops. And all a suggestion wheel is sort of a quadranted piece of paper or poster that asks people, based on your experience in today's conference, what would you keep, add, remove, or change? So if the food's terrible and the rooms are cold, you're going to hear about it here. You don't need to hear about it 40 times. And people often, a good way to get around that, especially with large conferences, is to give people sticky notes and then also have the option of like voting up stickers. So whether they're dots or fun animals or your logos, give people a way to sort of like agree. It's like the voting up on Reddit, right? So you can capture that, oh man, this was a really big issue versus this was a small issue on this. And so one of the really nice things about this is look, just based on visually looking at this, there were very few things that people thought we should just remove straight out from the conference. Look at how full that keep box is on here. And so right away you get that visual. And Sean, to your point about 80%, what about including visuals like this in a report to a funder or a board instead of those numbers that don't mean particularly anything? Because especially in a large conference, the visual impact of these resources can be really stunning. So I want to stop there and give a second for Q&A on this conference. This is an event, and Sean's going to keep us on time so that we make sure that we get through the rest of the content. But while you're typing in some more questions, I just want to share one more thought with you, because I get this question a lot around, okay, so we've now taken our post-conference survey away. We're putting up these signs and posters, but nobody's engaging in them. So I want to talk about that for just a second. How do you get people to come away from their conversations and really participate in these resources? So the first thing that I will say is the more that you can have volunteers and staff sort of manning the different areas and saying, hey, this is actually something we want you to participate in. That's the first step. And especially the first year that you do this, that's really, really important. Once you start to build the muscle that, hey, this is how we do evaluation at X, Y, and Z conference, the need to have that manpower goes down some. The second piece I would say is that we have had a really fun time incorporating these tools into the design of an event. So imagine if you made it a piece of the puzzle to say, hey, we have a little passport book for you, and every time you participate in a feedback mechanism, you get a sticker. And then at the end of the event, you get something special for having participated in all of these feedback events. Maybe it's a drawing or raffle, maybe it's a discounted registration on next year, maybe it's a lunch with the keynote speaker. Like, what can you do that will provide some incentive opportunities for participating in this? And then the second thing, or the third piece that I would say, is that we have found that people actually appreciate these alternative ways of engaging with the event, because conferences, especially multi-day conferences, are exhausting. And sometimes you just like need that excuse to not be talking to 5 people at a time. And so participating in these events, we've actually gotten the feedback that it's a nice opportunity for individuals to take a pause reflection break that is not just, let me go to the bathroom and hide there while I check my cell phone for 5 minutes. And with that, I will take some questions about this section, Sean, if there are any.
Yeah, we have a few. Can I tease something? We have not totally nailed this down, so I don't want to put you on the spot, even though I think I just did. So guys, and Elena and I still need to sort some of this stuff out, but very likely we're going to bring a lot of these ideas with us to ComNet in Austin. So if you're wondering, what does this look like in real time? Give us a couple months and hope that we can prevail upon Elena. So if you want to go in the chat box or hit her on Twitter and say, please help us do this, we're going to try to bring this to life in Austin so you can actually see this. So it's not a matter of you simply hearing us today, but we're going to actually put it into practice. You can see what it looks like, and we're going to learn alongside you. Okay, so now to the questions. Hannah says, what about the short leave behind evaluations that you leave on the tables during conference sessions? Are those useful or not so much?
Yeah, so I love them when they're really intentional. So my favorite leave behind evaluation on a table. So you can't just take your post-conference electronic survey, print it out, and put it on the table. That is a no-go. What is a really great idea is thinking about what specific piece of information do you want to be capturing in that moment, and how can you ask it in one question. So one of my favorite leave behind questions was from an evaluation of a conference that I was one of the plenary speakers at. And throughout the conference, we had these little sentiment cards. And what I mean by that was that these conference organizers had a really intentional flow of the conference. They wanted to trigger sort of particular emotional reactions and particular learnings throughout the conference that varied over time. And so we left these little tiny pieces of paper all over the place that were color-coded by the time of day. So you could match them back up to the sessions. And all they asked is, what are you feeling as you leave this session? One word. Use one word to describe how you're feeling during this session. And so what was so cool about it was that we could see that in, I'm just going to make this up, but during one of the keynotes, people were really excited. They were really motivated to go do their work. And the other keynote, it was like, I'm bored, I'm ready for lunch, like, no, not as much engagement. And then you had breakout sessions where people were like, man, I'm feeling invigorated, I'm feeling full of new knowledge. People break the one word thing, but in that way we got such useful, rich information. So I'm a fan of the leave behinds. One question, really targeted in what one question it is.
All right, so let's go from conferences to Rebecca's question, which is, it got voted up. 3 of you like this one. Rebecca Smith says, how would you do this with webinars? And
yeah.
Kristen, are we paying attention? I'm going to turn the camera on my colleague and partner in crime. How do you do this with webinars?
It's a really good question, and I don't have a terrific answer to it because, part of the thing about webinars is that the content that you're using in webinars changes all the time. And so you're not going to run this same webinar twice. And so my first question to you is like, what information about the webinar are you trying to get that would actually change what you were doing as a result? I think there's a couple of different tools that we use. One is just like the chat boxes and the Q&A as you're seeing today. So you can compare across webinars, like what is the comment engagement in any given webinar? What does the participation look like? There are a lot of great real-time polling tools that you can use in webinars as well. So we're not doing any of these today, but you could do sort of a poll anywhere throughout the process. There are also tools that are emerging that are webinar add-ins that are a little bit like the Facebook reactions on Facebook Live. So people can like ping in with like whether they're getting bored or whether they're really excited about a content. So those are emerging. I wouldn't say they're like ready for prime time yet. So, you know, it's always very strange to have an evaluator tell you not to evaluate, but that is often my advice for these things. It's like really think about what information you're trying to get at, and do you not already have that through some other mechanism?
Okay, one more question, guys, because I want to be mindful and respectful of Elena's time and yours. But Andrew, I think I'm pronouncing that properly, and I believe this is our friend Mandy, have a very similar question. So I'm going to see if I can put them together, which is, how do you have a conversation about ditching surveys with leadership? How do you convince them? You know, what if you get that answer? This is what we've always done. And Mandy asks sort of a variation of that. Is there a study or article or something that you've written that we can use to leverage to make the case to our colleagues that evaluation be done differently? I'm going to start by answering yes. As it turns out, Elena has written a book all about this. And if you got the webinar invitation, you got the link to buy it on Amazon. And if you don't mind walking it into your boss's office and going, here, there's a whole chapter on why this is really stupid. I mean, that's why she's here. We read the book and we're like, oh my God, we're doing everything wrong. So hopefully that's one, that might have been your answer, but now you don't have to do the self-plug. What else can you do to make the case?
Yeah, so I appreciate the self-plug because that really, in some ways, that is the answer. So the reason I wrote this book is because there's not great resources on this already. And so my approach to this work is how can we tackle evaluation struggle from all the different angles? And unfortunately, it can be a real uphill battle when your organization's leadership is stuck in that mindset of evaluations for reporting. It's for accountability. It's for our funders. And so my suggestions are a couple fold. So one is to look for opportunities where you don't need approval to do it. So maybe right now you can't ditch your post-conference survey, but you can start adding some of these point of contact approaches in addition to the post-conference survey, and then use that as a way to compare, hey, look at this rich information we got by asking people in real time compared to this, the question marks and the nones and the not applicables that we got on the post-conference survey as a way to start those conversations. I think another one is just on our website, there's a whole bunch of resources and examples of organizations that have really taken hold of evaluation as a learning process. And so sharing some of those with organizations, I think the first step is often showing your leadership that there is an alternative, that it doesn't have to be this process. But most often when I see the pushback around we need to keep our surveys because it's the way we've already been done, because it's the way we've always done it, it's because of one of these root mindset shifts that has to happen. So think about opportunities in your work. Maybe it's not the conference this year. Maybe it's just a smaller bit of what you do. Maybe some of these other things we're going to talk about today that can help to build that muscle around evaluation as a learning process instead of a reporting mechanism.
Cool. Well, let's head forward. We've got some questions from Sylvia, from Lauren, and a really nice piece of feedback from Sky. Thank you. That's awesome. We're psyched about this too. I think, if you don't mind, again, I'm going to put you on the spot, Elena. You'll answer questions that we don't get to on Twitter later. Is that cool?
I can answer them on Twitter. I can answer them offline, whatever you guys would prefer.
Okay, so we will make sure that we're not going to hide Elena. And again, hopefully she's going to be with us in Austin, so you have another crack at the egg. And we're going to do another one of these in a couple of weeks. But let's move forward to the next topic we wanted to attack. And you can take these questions to Twitter, or we will help you get in touch with her offline or online through email, whatever. Anyway, we'll get to it. Let's move ahead.
Excellent. So the second piece of your communication shop's work that we're going to talk through is around publications and reports. And I know this is a really core piece of work for some of you, and for others, it's like a secondary piece. So when I say reports and publications, I want you to think broader than just like the 50-page reports, and think about anything written, anything video, newsletters, annual reports, anything that you're putting out into the world, expecting other people to take and digest. So the first thing that I want to share with you is this study that the World Bank did back in 2014, which some of you may have already seen, that found that even for the World Bank, uptake of these reports is tiny. So for them, they found that over 31% of their policy reports are never downloaded. And for the World Bank, what they really care about is their policies getting into the hands of other journals, other policy sources, other places. And so against that metric, almost 87% of the reports that they put out were never cited in another place. So we just need to start from the assumption that people don't read your reports. And I know that that's heartbreaking and so not okay to say in a communications crowd, but it is the reality of how people get and consume information, that there's just so much out there. So if we start from that assumption, I think there's two reasons why why organizations are still putting out so much content. So the first one is that we still have hopes that we can break that 31% and that people will really use this information and really learn from it and really change their behavior based on it. So let's talk about that path first. If you're listening to me say people don't read your reports and you're saying, no, Elena, they really do, and this is why we do this work, this part of this conversation is for you. So if you really are putting out reports under the impression that people will use them and change their behavior, let's go back to that idea again of what information would help you do your jobs better. And so if the numbers of people downloading them are pretty low and probably not capturing the full range of people that have looked at it, what are some alternatives to that approach? So how can you learn about how people are getting information from you and how people are using information from you? And so the two methods that I use a lot in reports and publications, the first is around how do people get that information. So can you use evaluation as a way to trace a distribution path of a report? So to find out, okay, if we know that it goes to our board members and the 10 closest friends of the organization, could you use as evaluation as a way to understand where it goes next and why those individuals make the decision to forward it or not? Because they're probably not forwarding every report you send. So what about report A made them want to share it with someone, whereas report B didn't spur that? And so think about the usefulness of that information versus just saying, hey, report A was downloaded 20 times and report B was downloaded 19 times. Does that really tell us anything useful? Do we understand why? So I think a lot of this section is really about getting to the why behind those isolated numbers. The second method that I use a lot in reports and publications is user testing. So just like you would user test a website or an app or any technology like that, can you think about user testing a report and sitting down with people who are in sort of the target audience of who you want to be accessing this information, give them a couple of questions about sort of, have them talk through how they're navigating the report, what's really standing out to them, where their eye goes immediately, again, in a really structured, intentional way. So you might notice with these two methods that it's really becoming less about does the report get used, and it becomes more about how does the report get used. And in that way gets you more actionable information. And then you can lean on sort of the principles and values of the organization to justify the distribution and sort of assume that if it is being used in this way, if we can get it out to more people, then that's going to help increase the amount of use in this particular way.
Let me just give you a quick +1 for the idea of reaching out and creating these small focus groups. In a previous life, I worked in think tank land here in Washington, D.C., and you would be amazed at the number of policymakers, legislative staffers, and such who, if you ask them, can I show you a report? Tell me what works for you. Tell me what doesn't. How often they will step forward and say, yes, I'll help. Because they know you're making something to benefit them. But it's oftentimes true that what you're making is completely at odds with the way they work or the way their day is structured. We hand them a 50-page report when they have time to read 10 words. Incredibly helpful, and people are really generous with giving you that feedback for what it's worth.
Yep, I agree. So that's option one, is if your goal with these reports is really and truly to get it in the hands of the right people and for them to use it, let's focus on evaluation approaches that get you information to make that more likely to happen. If instead you hear me talk about, okay, your reports are probably not going to be read, 31% of them might not be read, and instead you say, well, that's fine, but we still have to do this because our reports and publications is how we build our organizational brand and our thought leadership in the community, then let's think about how we can use evaluation to really target that outcome. So maybe you're going to be doing reports anyway, because it's your way of saying that we're thought leaders in this community and that we have a respected brand. And so even if your reports are only getting downloaded 31% of the time, you're still going to do them. So now instead, could you focus on how people perceive you over time and how those reports influence how they perceive you? So you'll hear this, you've already heard it probably 20 times today, and we're going to spend the next 20 minutes just repeating it over and over again, but it is that learning focus. So it's really thinking about what could you change about your work, what would you change about your work, and what information would those decisions need to be based on. And so when we're making decisions around how to evaluate our work, the first question is, am I going to change this? And if the answer is no, then it's probably not something that's worth dedicating evaluation resources to. So just getting those numbers, getting those counts, and moving on with your life. If it is something that you really authentically want to improve and change, then the next question is, what's the best way to get useful information from about this question that I have, about this improvement plan that I have? And again, it's probably not download counts, because that doesn't get to the why, the root of the issue behind it. So before we get back into question and answer, I want to talk about one sort of related topic, which is this question of public relations and media outreach. So in some ways, it has some overlaps with reports and publications. It's about getting the message and the content from the organization out into the world. And so a lot of organizations use something like Meltwater or another monitoring program to report the eyeballs that are going to their media coverage, or in some cases, even sort of the return on investment or the cost of the earned media that they're getting. But the same way that download counts don't tell you a lot, I would really encourage you to question what those numbers are telling you. Because in most cases, they're really trying to oversimplify a complex process of how people get and digest information into one number. And so really thinking about, what does that number say to me, and can I at all adapt what I'm doing based on this information? One of the major downfalls that I see, and we'll get to this some when we talk about social media, is this idea of like, not all eyeballs are created equal. And so there is an issue around the idea that intensity and frequency might matter more than just straight up quantity. And so how might you get at that? How might you think about, okay, it's not eyeballs that we care about, it's the right eyeballs that we care about. So I would encourage you to think strategically about to what end you're investing in these public relations and media outreach efforts, and aligning your evaluation with those goals. So you might consider a similar process for your media outreach as you did for the reports and publications. So how are people finding this information about you, and what are they doing with it afterwards? Or you might take a case study approach. And so I saw a really nice example of this actually with a local media organization in Colorado, where they saw legislation that was passed, and they found out after the fact that it was because, well, because is a tricky word, but it was heavily influenced by a reporting that they did. And so this is another option, is you can actually go backwards. So you can think of it as, how can we build out case studies by finding examples of where this has gone really well, and backwards mapping what happened that worked well because of it. And they have taken those lessons and really applied it to how their work has shifted. Now, again, Sean, I recognize that this is a culture change, and you're going to ask me about it. Like, it is much sexier to be able to report thousands of people saw this newsletter. But it's really about shifting the mindset so that you're getting more meaty information that is of more value. It just looks so different from what we're used to. And I'm aware that that's an issue, and we can be friends on Twitter, and I'll commiserate over virtual drinks with you about it.
Fair enough. Yeah, so this is basically counter to everything those lovely people from Meltwater are selling you, which is, we're going to tell you how many impressions you made on that media hit and the fair market value of it. And you're saying, who cares? Who cares?
Do you care? I mean, do you care? If it's useful for you, continue to use it. I would just really be thinking about, is that actually of value to me versus to my board versus to my funders?
Which is another shift in mindset. Is there something that I can use to improve my work versus am I hitting marks that were invented by somebody else? And maybe that's a question there, Elena, which is, sometimes we're jumping to reach a point that someone else has assigned for us. That ED or that CEO who says, you know, success looks like we have, if we're talking about media or newsletters, you know, 1,500 people opened our newsletter. That's an artificial goal that someone else, not us, assigned. It may or may not be something that we can achieve, and it may or may not, whether we achieve that may give us no clear direction on whether we're building something that's satisfying or useful to people. So it sounds like, even if we're all believers, and I'm reading the comments in here, everybody's going, yeah, but, so I guess my question to you is, yeah, but how do we engineer this change with leadership and others who maybe have a more quantitative or in some cases just an old school approach to evaluating these things?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And the answer is not simple, right? This is in some ways a paradigm shift that's going to take some time, and it's going to be slow. So all of the people in this webinar, all the people who can take a nugget from this, any individual nugget from this, and apply it in their work is one step closer. This is also the time maybe you don't like buy the book and give it to your boss. Maybe you send it anonymously to your boss or your funder or your board chair or whatever that looks like. And maybe pre-flag the pages around how important it is when we're making evaluation decisions, and particularly evaluation design decisions, to involve the people whose job it affects. That is one of my big soapboxes, is this idea of leadership developing evaluation plans and models and benchmarks for jobs that they don't do. And so how can we encourage our leaders and everyone in our organization to engage the staff who's both responsible for the work and responsible for evaluating the work in the setting of those metrics, the deciding of the evaluation approaches. So you just flag that page and send the book anonymously. You can call me, I'll do that. I'll send it anonymously to them. They never have to know it came from you.
Related question, this came in a little bit earlier from our friend Kathleen. She says, leadership likes comparing historical metric results. Now, that could be a barrier to changing the process. How do we address that?
Oh, yes, I get this a lot. People, and it comes up in actually the post-conference surveys also, of like, they don't want to lose the longitudinal data. And so my question is always like, okay, so maybe that's a battle that you can't win. Like, that's the first question. It's like, is this a battle you can win? And if it's not a battle you can win, how can you minimize it? Because oftentimes, I really hope no one's boss is also on this call, but oftentimes those numbers, like, they are vanity metrics for a reason. And they, like, the people who care about those numbers aren't doing the digging into the legitimacy of it. So again, this is like a horrible thing for an evaluator to say, but is there a way for you to minimize the effort that goes into those reporting and monitoring efforts so that you can free yourself up for the more informative pieces? So can you just take the Google Analytics downloads instead of paying for the fancy service and spending time really diving into it, and have those numbers as the historical benchmark versus the other, and then spend more of your time on the other pieces? The other thing is just to start initiating those conversations about, okay, great, we've done the same thing and we've collected the same numbers for 5 years. Is this actually telling us anything anymore? Is this a valuable use of our time? It's, again, back to that culture shift, that paradigm shift. We get tricked into thinking that we have to do evaluation the same always. I would argue that your evaluation should actually change every single year because you're learning something new about your programs. And so this is a very circuitous way of saying, can you do both? Can you figure out a way to satisfy the folks who want those consistent numbers with as little effort as possible, and start to incorporate these new pieces? And then the same way we talked about in the conferences, do the compare and contrast of, is there more value in this versus this, to start pushing towards those more learning-oriented approaches.
John has a point here. He put this in the comment box, so I'm toggling between these two things. John says, where evaluation is concerned, there's definitely a difference between what you do to keep your job and what you do to accomplish your job. And it sounds like that's kind of the answer when it comes to getting to these paradigm shifts. Tristan's going like this, which means I think we have to keep going and move on to part 4.
Good. Yes, I will just say that I wholeheartedly agree with that. And there's a wonderful diagram that I think it's the Hewlett Foundation that's been pushing out. That's like, it's a 3-legged stool of measurement. So it's this idea that when we think of measurement, people have different ideas in mind. And so there's actually a pretty significant difference between feedback, evaluation, and monitoring. And I would characterize monitoring as those things you need to keep your job, and feedback and evaluation as the things you need to do your job. So I appreciate that point, and I wholeheartedly agree. And Google the 3-legged measurement stool. Maybe we can find it and put it on Twitter also.
I bet you Yabby just did. All right, going on to number 4. Social media. Yabby, listen up. No vanity metrics. Here we go.
Excellent. So we all know that social media has kind of become a requirement. You can't be a communication shop these days and not engage in social in some way. But it is really, really easy to get lost in the social media evaluation and metrics world. So you open up Facebook Analytics and you could spend hours just trying to figure out what all of the different numbers they report means, because they report different numbers all over the place. They report them split in different ways, and then they change them randomly throughout time. So it's like new every time you look at that analytics page. So the absolute best advice that I can give to you on social media metrics is to narrow your focus. There is absolutely no reason to be looking at every single metric that any of those analytics platforms give to you, so the insights platforms give to you. And no surprise on this end, what am I about to tell you? When you narrow it, you should do it intentionally based on what you're trying to achieve in the world. What a crazy concept. And so the first thing that you should do is to really think about, what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to do? Why are you engaging with social media? And that should dictate what you measure. So if, for example, you are a baby nonprofit and your goal is really to grow a network, to really figure out how can you grow an audience and grow an active community, then the only thing you should care about in that moment is how many new followers are you getting over time, and what is the reach of every post you can go through. And that's all you have to look at. Really, that is all you have to look at. It is just noise when you start reporting all of the other different insights. I will say we work with a program that is exclusively a social media program. They have no in-person presence. It is just a social media platform. And throughout the time that we have worked with them, we have consolidated and consolidated and consolidated the things that they look at. And so even for a really large program like this, they are going through this, and it is really helping them narrow their focus, figure out exactly what they are doing, and it has been successful in terms of reporting up to their superiors, because there's a logic behind it and there's a theory. And I think people are starting to catch on to the idea that most social media metrics are vanity related anyway. So the more that you can be specific and targeted with it, the better off you're going to be. I will also just say that these are not all created equal, right? You might be an organization that is stepping up over time. So you might say, hey, right now we are really focused on growing a network. And so you're going to be looking at followers and reach. But the purpose of growing that network is later to build thought leadership. And once we are in a position where our goal is to build thought leadership, then all we care about is shares. Because share is sort of like, it's a high bar of social engagement. So if you think about the ask behind each of these, reach is the lowest, right? It just shows up on your feed. That's what reach is. And so it's a really low bar of engagement. Click might be the next bar, right? Clicking is not a super hard thing to do to get people engaged. Commenting is a little bit harder, right? People are having to type something, and now that Facebook has made it so that your comments show up on your feed, it's become even higher thing. Because like, do you really want your friends to know that you commented on the cat video? And then the shares is like an even higher level, because then they are putting their reputation behind your brand. And so if you think about this is sort of escalating asks. And so you might want to think about the maturity of your organization and what's really appropriate to be focused on in that time. The other thing that this brings us back to is this idea of evaluation shouldn't look the same for 10 years. So maybe right now you're collecting one, and then the next year you're collecting the other. Or maybe your general focus is on generating a conversation and you're looking at those comments. But every year during fundraising season, all you care about is clicks through to your website and your donations page. And so don't think of this as like I'm picking shares as the thing to look at for the next 20 years of my life. It should be fluid. It might change seasonally. If you're really sophisticated, you might start categorizing posts like this. So, oh, this post was really generated to direct traffic, and this one was really generated to build thought leadership, and think about it in that way. So I am going to stop there and use the last 10 minutes of our time together to do some more Q&A. But I just want to say that my approach with all of this work is, first of all, just how intentional can you be in thinking through what is the purpose of this work, and how can we align evaluation to help us understand what's working and what's not towards that end goal. And then the second thing I would suggest is, like, this is a lot of material. And again, this is only the first half. We're going to come back together to talk about how communication shops can play an active role in the evaluation of their organization. So how do you take evaluation information and help disperse it? How do you help your leadership get on board with these pieces? We will add that to the content because I know it's a hot topic and I'd like to spend some more time thinking about it. So my goal with today is not for you to take everything that we've covered in this webinar and apply it tomorrow. My goal today is for you to find one nugget that you feel like you could try in your organization and try that out as a first step. So Sean, any questions that have come up?
Yeah, we've got a number of questions. And guys, just a reminder, I am looking in the little thing that says Q&A for your questions, and you can vote them up. You literally can put a thumbs up if you want to hear somebody else's question get asked. So I'm going to start with Olivia's. Olivia asked, we often end up trying to collect demographic data. Oops, where did Olivia's things? Oh, here it is. Okay, we often end up trying to collect demographic data as well as getting real feedback. Oftentimes, board members, partners, and program staff really want this, leading not just to a survey, but a really long survey. How can you reconcile that? Getting that real-time feedback, but also collecting the who's actually giving it to us, who's at this event, who's participating, who's part of our audience.
Yeah, so let me do the short version of a very long answer to that question, which is that I have some really strong opinions about making sure that we're really clear before we engage in any evaluation efforts to outline what are the key questions that we want answered through this process, and then only asking questions that align with that in some way. So if you're an equity-focused organization and one of your most important questions is how do these outcomes differ by demographic characteristics, then by all means you should be collecting demographic information. But if your demographics are not directly linked to something that is core to your ability to do your job, you should not be collecting them. Everybody makes this misstep. I don't want to call it an error, but a misstep. On my dissertation, I collected 19 demographic variables about everyone who participated, and I analyzed 0 of them for my actual dissertation. And so you're asking questions that you're not doing anything with. So one of my colleagues at Vantage developed this really wonderful tool that it basically lines up on one side, it's a 2-column table, and on one side it says, here are the key questions that we want to answer through our evaluation. And then any evaluation tool that she does, she matrixes it. So she says, okay, these 4 questions are about question A, and these 3 questions are about question B. And so in that way, it gives you the ability to say, oh, this demographic question is not related to any of the questions we care about, and so we need to leave it off, because survey by committee is one of the most dangerous things in survey design, and this matrix comparison gives you a little bit of backup to fight against that and to say, no, actually, we are limited in what we can ask of people, and that doesn't meet the threshold for inclusion.
Okay, jumping back in time, Carla has a question. A few folks want to hear the answer to this. How do you feel about the effectiveness of 2 to 3 question evaluations on apps at the close of a breakout session or workshop? This is obviously during a gathering or a conference or an event.
Yeah.
How good are those app evaluations?
So I considered putting in a little mention of that in here. The challenge with the apps is that it varies so much depending on the conference attendees. So I go to, let's just use 2 examples. I go to 2 conferences every single year. One is the Colorado Nonprofit Association Conference, and one is the American Evaluation Association Conference. The Colorado Nonprofit Association Conference, I hope no one's on this call, I begrudgingly download the app every year. Like, I do not want to use it. I do not want to look at it. I just want to be told which sessions I signed up for and go to it. And I don't really know what that's about for me personally, whether it's like about an app usefulness or just the history of the event. Whereas the American Evaluation Association event, I download that event, I use it all day long at the entire event. And so you need to make that decision based on how embedded your app is in your conference. So if you're the American Evaluation Association, and a lot of folks are in my category where we really rely on that app, then that's a great place to be popping up those evaluation questions. If you're the Nonprofit Association where you're still having trouble getting people to engage in your app, and where it's not something that people are relying on and looking at between sessions, then it's not the right choice. And so unfortunately with the apps, it's not a clear cut, like I love them or I hate them. I just think it really depends on which camp you fall into in terms of use of your app.
Gotcha. Okay, Kathleen has a question. I think, Kathleen, your question is actually about what we're going to talk about next time, but let's go ahead. I love this paradigm shift that you're going for. How are you evaluating your steps and learning along the way? For example, what can you share about how you're going to evaluate this webinar, the book, or other parts of how you're commuting this set of practices? So how will we know at the end of this whether this webinar was any good, or for that matter, notwithstanding that I'm sure that the book is on its way to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, how do we actually know if it's useful? How are you evaluating these things?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. And I think that this is related to that question of, okay, so what is my goal with this work? And what are the things that I have the ability to do or willingness to change? And then how do I get information that's going to influence that? So things that we look at, the very first thing we look at is like, there are hundreds of people on this webinar, and that is huge for us. That to us signals that there is an appetite for this work. The second piece that we look at is oftentimes after events, I get a lot of follow-up emails and questions and comments. That's another thing that I look at, and I keep pretty close track of those comments. The third piece is I'm hoping that somebody on my team, I think there is someone on my team who's looking at some of the comments that are coming in the public chat box and the stuff that's coming in on Twitter. And so a lot of times that's how we guide, how we tweak the content moving forward. So even in the context of this webinar, I did a version of this at a conference last Friday. And I thought really carefully about what questions was I seeing, what comments was I seeing, and I used that as a way to inform how I redesigned this training. And I will think more about the long term, how we're doing this, because we don't have a good plan for that right now. It really feels like we're at the very beginning of this movement and this paradigm shift. And so a lot of it is more subjective than I think you want from me right now, in terms of just, I'm starting to hear the chatter shift, and that's a good thing for me. Another piece we're looking at is right now, we get a lot of people who are sort of interested in this conversation, but not ready to commit to it as a speaking topic. And so that's something we'll be tracking over time. It's like, how hard is it for evaluation to take center stage over time? And I will have another answer for you in April.
Gotcha. And this is ultimately about thought leadership, right? So a piece of this is not only people participating in the webinar or buying the book, but sharing it, right?
Yes.
And in some cases testifying, I'm changing my practices, and taking that little nugget from today and putting it to work. So if you do, my guess is, if I can again sort of act on your behalf, maybe send Elena to that email right there. If you end up doing something a little bit differently, and I've seen a couple of you guys have events coming up, if you're gonna maybe add something into the mix you weren't gonna do before, let Elena know. Probably very helpful for her to know. Also helpful for her to know where to put her emphasis as she's talking about these things going forward. Our friend Rebecca from the William Penn Foundation in Philly, I think is going to have to be our last question. Rebecca's question is, as a funder, we think about connecting grantees as a key role that we can play to help them unearth new opportunities to collaborate. How can we observe this? So hard to tell if someone is chatting with someone new or someone they already know, and hard to tell how substantive those conversations are. Are they talking about how awesome the new Casey Musgraves album is, which is super awesome, or are they actually talking about something that's not related to the CD or iPhone music that they were just listening to, and something related to their jobs?
Yep, absolutely. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. So one is the same way that we have like learning walls or commitment cards. Sometimes at events that are really connection focused, we'll actually throw that up as a display or as a card. So instead of what's the most exciting thing that you've learned today, who's the most exciting person you've talked to today? And then you might be able to have like incorporate something where you're asking them in that display, who's the most exciting person you talked to today, and was it a new connection or an old connection? So you could do color coded cards. So green for a new connection, blue for an existing connection that you reconnected with. If you wanted to like fancy it up, which I'm not sure is a great idea, because every time you make it more complicated, it like decreases the likelihood that people will complete the whole thing. You could ask them, who's the most exciting person you connected with today, and what did you talk about? And have them sort of submit that feedback. The other piece is that this is a really good opportunity to think about how you might be able to collect feedback from a narrower group. So the same way that in the reports and publications, we talked about how do you find the target audience and really learn about how they're using it, could you find a subset of conference participants and do some targeted pre-interviews, post-interviews, focus groups with them? The other piece that we didn't talk about is that often we'll do that, like, who are you connecting with, as a little mini interview. So we'll have volunteers walking around doing one question interviews to grab that qualitative data. But I think the middle piece that I suggested around identifying some folks who you could do some more targeted experience mapping with, that would probably be the best way to get at that. So within this group of 20 people, what can we learn about their experience at the conference in terms of connecting with people, whether they're new or existing contacts? And then how can we use that information to figure out, is that happening at the broad scale? Are there examples there that we can really take away from this?
All right. Well, thank you, Elena. This has been awesome. On behalf of, gosh, I think we had over 550 people sign up for this webinar. So if that gives you any sense of how intense the interest is around this, we're going to be back. We're going to do this again in a few weeks. We're going to talk about, again, as Elena said, we're going to talk about how to take what you've learned and communicate it out in ways that are useful and meaningful. So flipping this on its head a little bit. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Grateful for Elena. She survived the bomb cyclone to be with us. We will be back in a couple weeks' time, and I think we actually have another webinar in the interim. Is that right, Tristan? I'm also supposed, which is I think with Apolitical, about policy advocacy. I'm also supposed to tell you that, is it Friday is the final day for the Jones Award? Sunday evening at 11:59, Tristan will be sitting at his computer waiting to turn the switch off. The Clarence B. Jones Impact Award, which is one way that we measure folks who are doing comms for good that makes a difference. If you want to nominate somebody, you can. There's no fee. Don't even need to be a network member to do it, but that will end on Sunday, so please help us there. And we'll be back in touch with you all very, very soon. The newsletter from the network's coming out in a couple days, so everything you need to know that I didn't just say will be there. Everybody be well. Elena, again, deep gratitude. Thank you very, very much on behalf of everybody, and we'll see you all soon. Be well. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you.